They broke the wrong empath. The most dangerous moment is not when an empath cries. It is when they become calm. It is when the person who used to explain every feeling, defend every intention, and keep the connection alive suddenly stops trying to be understood. Because some people do not realize what they are breaking while they are breaking it. They think they are breaking your heart, but what they are really breaking is their access. They think they are making you weaker, but they are actually forcing you to wake up from the version of love that kept you abandoning yourself. And here is the part they understand too late. When an empath finally stops explaining, it is not because they have become cold. It's because something inside them has finally become clear. And once clarity enters the room, manipulation loses its language. There are people who meet an empath and mistake softness for weakness. They see kindness and think it has no boundary. They see forgiveness and assume the door will always open. They see a person who feels deeply, listens carefully, notices small changes, and tries to understand the pain behind someone's behavior. And instead of protecting that kind of heart, they test it. They test how much disrespect it can survive. They test how many lies it will excuse. They test how many times it will return after being made to feel invisible. They test whether guilt can pull it back. They test whether silence can make it panic. They test whether love can be used like a leash. They do not break the empath in one dramatic moment. They do it in small, repeated ways. A dismissive tone here, a cold silence there, a promise that sounds sincere but never becomes behavior. A conversation where the empath shares pain and somehow ends up apologizing for having pain at all. And every time this happens, the empath loses a little more trust, not only in the other person, but in their own ability to feel safe around them. They thought the empath's patience meant the empath had no limit. They did not understand that some limits do not arrive as anger. Some limits arrive as silence. Some limits arrive as a body that no longer reacts, a heart that no longer reaches, and a soul that finally says, I cannot keep paying for this connection with my peace. An empath may stay longer than most people. They may forgive what others would walk away from. They may look for the good in someone who keeps showing them harm. But that does not mean they are blind. It means they are grieving the truth slowly. First, they stop expecting honesty. Then they stop asking for emotional safety. Then they stop sharing what hurts. Then they stop hoping the other person will suddenly understand. And by the time they physically leave, they have already left 100 times inside. That is why people act shocked when the empath changes. They say, you are not the same anymore. But they never ask what happened to the version of the empath who used to try. They miss the warmth, but they do not take responsibility for the coldness they created. They miss the old access, but they forget how many times they punished that access. They miss the person who used to answer quickly, explain gently, forgive easily, and carry the emotional weight alone. But the truth is simple. The empath did not disappear. They were slowly taught to become unreachable. There is a certain kind of pain that does not make noise anymore. It stops asking questions. It stops sending long messages. It stops looking for proof. It stops rehearsing conversations in the mind. It simply stands up inside the person and says, this is no longer love, this is survival. Because the empath who has been hurt in the same place too many times does not always become bitter. Sometimes they become honest. They begin to see that some connections were not love. They were familiar pain. They begin to understand that being needed is not the same as being valued. They begin to notice that some people do not want intimacy. They want access without accountability. For a long time, the empath may have believed that if they loved better, explained softer, stayed calmer, or gave more, the other person would finally understand. They believed the wound could be healed by enough patience. They believed that if they could just show enough compassion, the cruelty would soften. But compassion cannot heal someone who benefits from your silence. Love cannot transform someone who refuses to see what their behavior costs you. And no amount of emotional intelligence can create emotional responsibility in a person who only becomes aware when there are consequences. Because when an empath finally sees that their overgiving was not always love, but sometimes fear, everything begins to shift. They start asking harder questions. Was I being kind, or was I afraid of being rejected? Was I being patient, or was I afraid of being abandoned? Was I forgiving them, or was I protecting a fantasy because the truth was too painful to face? These questions can shake a person's identity because many empaths were praised for being understanding. They were called mature because they swallowed their feelings. They were called strong because they did not complain. They were called loving because they made room for everyone else's pain. Somewhere along the way, they learned to become safe for others before they ever learned to feel safe inside themselves. So when someone breaks an empath, they are not just breaking a relationship. They are touching an old wound. They are reopening the place where the empath first learned that love meant reading moods, preventing conflict, earning approval, and becoming smaller so someone else could remain comfortable. That is why betrayal hits an empath so deeply. It is not only about what happened, it is about what it confirms. It confirms the old fear that maybe their love will never be protected. It confirms the old ache that maybe people only value them when they are useful. It confirms the quiet lesson that their feelings matter only after everyone else's feelings have been managed. Then the shift begins. They stop asking only, why did they do this to me? And begin asking, why did I keep abandoning myself to keep them close? That question is not self-blame, it is liberation. Because the moment the empath turns toward themselves with honesty, they take back the energy they spent trying to decode someone who kept choosing confusion. And here's what makes this transformation powerful. The empath does not need to become cruel to become free. They do not need revenge. They do not need to make the other person suffer. They do not need to prove who was right. They simply begin to stop participating in their own emotional destruction. They expect the empath to fight. They expect a dramatic confrontation. They expect long messages, tears, explanations, one more attempt to make them understand. But the awakened empath does something more powerful. They withdraw their energy from the pattern. They stop trying to convince someone to value them. They stop pleading for basic respect. They stop turning every insult into a lesson, every silence into a puzzle, every betrayal into a reason to become more patient. Because some people only had power because the empath kept responding. They only felt important because the empath kept explaining. They only felt in control because the empath kept trying to repair what they kept breaking. The empath's attention became the fuel. The empath's pain became the proof that they still cared. Suddenly, the person who thought they were in control feels the absence. Not because the empath is playing a game, but because the emotional labor is gone. The warmth is gone. The rescue is gone. The person who once carried the connection finally sets it down, and this is where the silence becomes heavier than any argument. This silence is not punishment. It is not manipulation. It is the nervous system finally refusing to keep living in alarm. It is the body saying, I cannot keep calling this love when it keeps costing me my peace. It is the heart saying, I can care about you and still not give you access to keep hurting me. That is emotional maturity, not hatred, not revenge. Maturity is the ability to see someone's wounds without volunteering to become the place where they discharge them. But a wound does not give someone the right to wound you. A painful past does not give someone permission to make you pay for what they never healed. And understanding someone's trauma does not mean you must become the container for their unresolved damage. The person who broke the wrong empath may feel confused because the old reactions are gone. The empath no longer sends paragraphs, no longer explains the obvious, no longer says, I just want you to understand how I feel, no longer bends their entire nervous system around someone else's emotional immaturity into the wrong person. That feels threatening because they were used to the empath being emotionally available even in pain. They were used to receiving tenderness even after causing harm. They were used to the empath trying to keep the bond alive at any cost. They were used to the empath making excuses. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they did not mean it. Maybe they are afraid of love. Maybe they are wounded. Maybe they need more time. But one day, the empath realizes that an explanation is not an excuse and a wound is not a free pass. There is a moment when the empath realizes that peace is not emptiness. Peace is what their body was begging for while they were trapped in chaos and calling it connection. Missing someone does not mean they were healthy for you. Feeling pulled back does not mean you should return. Sometimes your body is not craving love. It is craving the familiar pattern, even if that pattern was breaking you. This is one of the hardest parts. Empaths often fall in love with potential. They can see who someone could become. They can feel the goodness buried beneath the defense. They can imagine the healed version, the honest version, the softer version, the version who finally understands. And because they can see that possibility so clearly, they sometimes stay loyal to a future the other person is not choosing. But potential is not a relationship. Potential is not safety. Potential is not repair. You cannot build a life with who someone might become while they keep refusing to take responsibility for who they are right now. The empath begins to stop asking, who could they be? And starts asking, who are they consistently choosing to be with me? That question changes everything. It cuts through excuses. It cuts through chemistry. It cuts through the stories the empath created to survive disappointment. They notice how the apology came only when they pulled away. They notice how affection returned only when access was threatened. They notice how every conversation turned back on them. They notice how their pain was minimized. Their boundaries were treated like attacks, and their needs were framed as too much. This is the turning point. The empath does not need to hate the person. They simply stop betraying themselves to keep the bond. They stop confusing loyalty with endurance. They stop calling emotional hunger love. They stop making excuses for people who understand exactly what they're doing when they might lose you, but pretend not to understand when it is time to repair you, because a healed empath cannot be controlled by guilt the same way. They cannot be pulled back by potential the same way. They cannot be manipulated by silence the same way. They cannot be bought with tiny moments of tenderness after long seasons of emotional harm. This is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about becoming loyal to reality. The empath who accepts reality stops giving unlimited chances to people who use chances as permission. They thought the empath's love meant the empath would never leave. They thought tenderness meant they could always return. They thought forgiveness meant the door had no lock. But they did not understand that every time they betrayed the empath's trust, they were teaching the empath how to live without them. Every disappointment was training. Every broken promise was preparation. Every dismissed feeling was evidence. Every night the empath cried alone was becoming emotional distance. That is why the final goodbye can look sudden to the person who caused the pain. But to the empath it was not sudden. It was the last drop in a cup that had been overflowing for a long time. They were not hard to love. They were easy to use because they kept calling inconsistency pain instead of disrespect. They kept translating selfishness into fear. They kept turning neglect into a wound to be understood. They kept making the other person's emotional immaturity more important than their own emotional safety. But not anymore. Here is the action step that can change everything. Before you answer the next message, before you explain yourself one more time, before you give another chance, ask one question in writing. Am I responding from love or am I responding from fear? If it is love, it will still include self-respect. If it is fear, it will usually include panic, guilt, urgency, or the need to prevent someone from leaving. Love does not require you to abandon your body's warning signals. Love does not require you to silence your truth. Love does not require you to prove that you are worth basic decency. Write the question down. Look at it before you reply. Let it slow you down. Because the old empathic pattern often moves fast. It rushes to fix. It rushes to soothe. It rushes to explain. It rushes to save the relationship before asking whether the relationship is saving them back. Because when you pause, you stop reacting from the wounded child who fears abandonment. You begin responding from the adult self who understands that being left by the wrong person is not the same as being unloved. You begin to see that panic is not always truth. Sometimes panic is the echo of old conditioning. This is where the empath becomes grounded. They can say no without writing an essay. They can leave a message unanswered without drowning in guilt. They can let someone misunderstand them without rushing to repair their image. They can accept that some people will call boundaries cruelty because they were benefiting from the absence of them. Because once you stop needing to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you, your life becomes quieter. You stop performing innocence. You stop defending your heart to people who already decided to see it incorrectly. You stop chasing emotional justice from someone who cannot even be honest with themselves. And you begin to understand that closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop reopening the wound to check if it still hurts. Sometimes closure is accepting that the apology you deserved may never come. Sometimes closure is deciding that your healing cannot depend on the person who harmed you finally becoming conscious. You can validate your own pain. You can name what happened. You can believe yourself. You can stop negotiating with the part of you that still thinks love must be proven through suffering. Because love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is a wound wearing the language of connection. When they broke the wrong empath, they did not create someone heartless. They created someone who finally learned that a heart can stay open while the door stays closed. That is one of the most powerful forms of healing. To not become cruel, but to become discerning. To not lose sensitivity, but to stop offering it to people who treat it as something to exploit. The person who once had unlimited access now meets a boundary. The person who once pulled the empath back with guilt now meets silence. The person who once relied on the empath's empathy now meets the empath's clarity. But the empath knows the truth. They know how much they tried. They know how many nights they questioned themselves. They know how many times they softened their own pain to protect the other person from guilt. They know how much they loved. They know how badly they wanted it to work. That is why the new empath feels different. They are not trying to be seen by the person who hurt them. They are seeing themselves. They are not trying to make the other person understand their worth. They are living from it. They are not trying to win a battle. They are stepping out of the battlefield completely. Create power does not announce itself. It does not beg for recognition. It does not turn pain into performance. It does not need the person who broke trust to suffer. Quiet power simply chooses peace and becomes unavailable for anything that keeps reopening the wound. A performance is the apology that sounds beautiful but changes nothing. A pattern is what happens after the apology. A performance is affection when someone feels you pulling away. A pattern is how they treat you when they think you are secure. A performance is regret when they lose access. A pattern is whether they respected access when they had it. The empath who learns this becomes almost impossible to fool in the old ways. They begin to understand that real love does not require constant decoding. Real love does not keep you in survival mode. Real love does not punish you for having needs. Real love does not make you feel guilty for wanting emotional safety, because many empaths were taught to tolerate unsafe love and call it depth. They were taught that the more painful something felt, the more meaningful it must be. They were taught that longing meant connection, anxiety meant passion, and inconsistency meant mystery. When the empath reaches this place, they stop chasing people who activate their wounds. They stop calling emotional chaos a deep connection. They stop measuring love by how much they can endure. They begin to measure love by how safe they feel being honest, soft, imperfect, and fully themselves. They broke the wrong empath because they thought the pain would make the empath smaller. But the pain made the empath truthful. They thought the betrayal would make the empath beg. But it made the empath listen to the part of themselves that had been whispering for years. They thought the empath would keep circling back. But the empath learned that not every door deserves to be reopened. Just because it once felt like home, they expected the empath to become broken. Instead, the empath became boundaried. They expected the empath to become desperate. Instead, the empath became still. They expected the empath to keep seeking closure. Instead, the empath became their own closure. And the most powerful part is this: the empath no longer needs the person who hurt them to regret it. They no longer build their healing around someone else's realization. If regret comes, it comes. If an apology comes, it comes. If the person finally understands years later that belongs to them, the empath's freedom is no longer waiting at someone else's doorstep. It is here, in the body, in the breath, in the quiet morning without emotional chaos, in the phone that no longer has to be checked with fear, in the nervous system that slowly learns it does not have to brace for the next disappointment, in the heart that discovers it can be soft again, but this time with wisdom, awake to the cost of overgiving, awake to the difference between compassion and self-abandonment, awake to the reality that some people are not confused by your pain, they are inconvenienced by your boundaries. Awake to the truth that love without respect is not love you are meant to survive. So if they broke you, Understand this. They may have broken the version of you that begged to be chosen, but they did not break the part of you that knows how to rise. They may have damaged your trust, but they also revealed where your trust needed protection. They may have made you question your worth, but they also forced you to stop placing your worth in the hands of people who mishandled it. You are no longer the person who ignores the first red flag because the apology sounds sincere. You are no longer the person who gives unlimited emotional credit to people who keep overdrawing your peace. You are no longer the person who believes being loving means staying accessible to those who keep proving they cannot handle your heart with care. Because the wrong empath is the one who finally turns pain into discernment. The wrong empath is the one who stops using empathy as a way to avoid grief. The wrong empath is the one who looks at the truth, even when the truth hurts, and chooses themselves without needing to make a performance out of leaving. Because you did change. You changed from someone who kept reaching back into the fire hoping it would become warm instead of burning. You changed from someone who believed love meant being endlessly available. You changed from someone who thought losing them would be worse than losing yourself. The empath they used to know was loving but exhausted, kind but self-abandoning, forgiving but unprotected, hopeful but slowly disappearing. The empath you are becoming is still loving but awake, still kind but clear, still forgiving but no longer accessible to repeated harm, still hopeful but now your hope includes yourself. Not that they come back, not that they suffer, not that they finally understand. The victory is that you no longer need to be broken open every time someone refuses to handle your heart with respect. You can leave the lesson without carrying the bitterness. You can remember the pain without living inside it. You can honor the love you gave without pretending the harm did not happen. You can be grateful for who you became without being grateful for what they did. And one day you may notice something beautiful. You will no longer rehearse the conversation in your mind. You will no longer imagine the apology. You will no longer feel the same pull toward the chaos. You will hear their name, remember the chapter, and feel the calm of someone who finally came home to themselves. That is when you know the breaking did not end you. It returned you. And in the next video, you will understand why the moment an empath stops explaining themselves is often the moment people begin to feel their absence the deepest. Because the silence of an awakened empath is not emptiness. It is the sound of a life finally choosing peace.